Buenas tardes y bienvenidos a esta nueva edición de Voces en Acción. Hoy, Academia BID le da la más cordial bienvenida a Magdalena Moreno Mujica y Sunil Iyengar. El evento será en inglés y contará con servicios de interpretación en español y portugués. Puedes elegir tu idioma en el sector inferior del icono del mundo. Você pode escolher seu idioma na parte inferior no icono do mundo. Trinidad, the floor is yours.
Hello to everybody, and welcome to the Inter-American Development Bank, to the Academia BIDAcademy. And today, my name is Trinidad Saldívar, and I'm the chief of the unit of creativity and culture here at the bank. And we are welcoming you to the fourth edition or fourth session of Voices in Action, special edition creativity. And we are here at the headquarters of the IDB with Sunil Iyengar, and very far away, Magdalena Mujica. She is in Melbourne, Australia. She is joining us from there. And we are going to talk about something that is really important in terms of public policy, and it's the importance of data in the creative and cultural industries. I know that we are sharing with you in our chat the bios of both of our guests, but anyway, I will tell you a little bit about them because they have a really interesting bios, and we would like to share that. But also, we would like to hear from you, from the audience. And if you have any questions during the session, please write your questions in the chat. You can write it in any language, then we will translate it. And but also you will be finding in the chat different links with publications that you here at the back. All this material that we will be sharing with you. And I will start with Sunil Iyengar. I just learned how to pronounce your last name. And Sunil directs the Office of Research and Analysis at the National Endowment for the Arts here in the United States. We are almost neighbors here. And under his leadership, the office has produced dozens of research reports, hosted periodic research events and webinars, and led strategic plan developments for the agency. This is really interesting, and we are always looking for the material you publish because it's really an example for what we are doing and what we would like to learn in our countries. And virtually, we do have Magdalena Moreno. She's the executive director of the International Federation of Arts Council and Culture Agencies, IFACA. So it's a global organization. And she was a member of the UNESCO Expert Facility Group between 2019 and 2022 to support the implementation of the 2005 Convention. She is author of the chapter Building Resilient and Sustainable Cultural and Creative Sectors in the 2022 UNESCO Global Report. So prior of this, Magdalena was the head of the International Affairs and the National Council of Culture and the Arts in Chile. So I would like to start with our guest now. As I mentioned, you can find more information about our guest in our chat, but talking about the importance of having data, collecting data in the creative industries. Why is important? Why is important for public policy? Why do we need to know what is happening with these industries? And so in your perspective, Sunil, and we will start first with Magdalena. So Sunil, you have to think about while Magdalena is telling us, but why, Magdalena, since you lead this institution, IFACA, this organization, why is data important for public policies? Why for the governments it's important to get this data to really shape and design the public policies in the different countries? The floor is yours, Magdalena.
Thank you very much. It is a real pleasure to be here with you. I'm going to start my presentation, and I hope to, if you're not already convinced, to convince you even further why it is so critical to have that data available. There's one small phrase that I will say in Spanish. I just want to alert those that are translating. But if you bear with me, I will share my screen and we can get started with me trying to convince you. Okay, so just want to confirm that you can see it. Does that look okay? Yep, great, great. Well, first of all, I'd like to say that I'm speaking from the land of the Boibaro people. It's the East Kulin Nation, and I pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. I'm in the outer skirts of Melbourne, Victoria, in Australia. I'm going to say something in Spanish. Mi nombre es Magdalena Moreno Mujica, como ya comentaba Trinidad, soy la directora ejecutiva de la Federación Internacional de Consejos de las Artes y Ministerios de Cultura, conocida como IFACA. Soy chilena, radico en Australia y quería solamente decir que si vienen las preguntas en español y en portugués también las puedo entender. Es un placer estar aquí. Quiero agradecer a Trinidad y a Martín por esta importante invitación, y también quiero agradecer, me es muy grato estar con mi gran colega Sunil del National Endowment for the Arts, que realmente es un experto, yo no soy experta, pero a ver cómo vamos a dialogar en este día para poder convencerlos de la importancia de los datos en el sector cultural y creativo. I'll move back to English now. So I run an organization that is made up of government agencies from across 90 countries. 56% of those are developing countries, 44% of those are developed. I need to know this so that when we are developing services for them, they are tailored to their needs. And I know we can reach a particular group of constituents. I know that the needs for our arm's length agencies, such as the National Endowment for the Arts, that have delegated authority, are going to tackle issues differently related to the cultural sector than those that maybe are not as autonomous or are part of a whole of government systems and processes in the case of ministries. It's also worth noting that 20% of our members are in the Americas, or what constitutes the Inter-American Development Bank's remit. I can continue to drill down and see who speaks Spanish. I can segment that further in terms of mandates, what sort of legislations, focus, priorities they have. This starts to give me a picture of who I'm working with. Although this information may seem obvious or basic, it is really a way in which we make the case, or maybe even storytelling. And I want to go back to this notion of storytelling. But it is really important when you have an argument, your argument takes a different life when you have evidence and data to back it up. Excuse me if I'm looking sideways, but I think I've got my screen swapped around, but bear with me. Okay, let's go to a much larger scale. As Trinidad mentioned, I was one of the authors of the global report, the 2022 global report. UNESCO published the Reshaping Cultural Policies for Creativity, Addressing Culture as a Public Good. I had to review quadrennial reports for 96 countries, which was an average of about 150 pages per country. I had to provide an analysis on their legislative developments, their employment figures, their investment and budget portfolios for culture, the state of the professionalization of the cultural and creative sector, as well as the impact of COVID, amongst many, many things. And I do encourage you, it's not a self-promotional exercise. This is a really important document, particularly all of the work that my fellow authors have done. So a brief overview, the 2005 Convention for the Protection and Promotion of the Diversity of Cultural Expression is a really important document for those of us working in the cultural and creative sectors. It's a legally binding international document, and it's focused on the cultural and creative sector as an ecosystem. It looks at the cultural value chain, ensuring that artists and cultural professionals can create, produce, and disseminate their work, and for all of us to enjoy the diverse cultural goods and services to lead a more fulfilling life in one's own term. It is also a very effective policy development tool, and it can help governments understand what's happening in other contexts. So back to my challenge. It took me 18 months to gather all the material to write this chapter. One of the biggest challenges I faced was the lack of data. How could I tell an accurate story and provide meaningful recommendations, which was my task, when often the information was limited, not verified, inconsistent, or simply didn't exist? How could I talk globally when the information was not of the world, but of certain countries and regions that had the financial means to gather that information? I knew, because of the work at Edifica, that there was tremendous work in the small island states, in Africa, in the Caribbean, but I did not have the data. So that became quite a challenge to create a narrative in a consistent manner. How do I address all the cultural sectors when information available, for example, in the film and audiovisual sector, was so significantly more developed than that of the performing or the visual arts? Moreover, when I found possible data that could be used, it was not standardized, comparable, and periodical. And an example of that is, for example, what does a culture budget look like? In some countries, culture budget does not include craft because it's seen as a trade. In other countries, it doesn't include architecture. In other countries, it doesn't include the creative, the gaming and the kind of the tech areas. So creating a standardization that's comparable is almost impossible. So this is what we uncovered with our fellow authors and UNESCO and the assistance of Bob Consulting, which is a data collecting agency. In general, it noted that while the creative and cultural sectors contribution represents 3.1% of the global GDP and made up 6.2% of all employment, there has been a steady decline on the public investment for culture over the last 10 years. Now, that in itself is quite a challenge for our members in terms of supporting a growing sector. It is also worth noting that the employment figures reference those that are measurable. And I'm sure Sunil can talk much more accurately about this. And I'll come back to it. But I found that when researching global figures, global data is very limited. And so much of the cultural and creative workforce, particularly in developing countries and particularly in our regions further south, Latin America, it was more informal. Project by project, or this concept of the gig economy, less regulated and generally undocumented. Hence, I suspect that the real figures of the unemployment are not those that are stated here, but are significantly higher. But how do we prove them? Exports of goods and services have also significantly increased, as has the digital transformation. Yet this does not necessarily mean that the creative and cultural sectors are better resourced, but rather there is more demand and more revenue. While a major issue persists on the unevenness of the distribution of that wealth, and more than often than not. Moreover, with the challenges around public spending, we're also seeing decline in the international aid on culture and recreation. Again, this is data that we have. This is a critical time when the cost of living is increasing and the pandemic has increased the challenges for developing countries to actual financial resources. Therefore, we are living in a world that is highly polarized, and it is concerning to see threats against also artists. Again, data that we do have. This is about their lives and also their livelihoods. The challenges on artistic freedom also extend to the cultural workers struggling to secure decent social and economic conditions. So as you can see, if I didn't have this data, I could not make these statements or create these arguments, neither could my colleagues. So back to Edifica. The purpose of the Secretariat is to support and engage members, to forge platforms for collaboration and exchange, and very important, to be a trusted source of intelligence. We have 4 objectives, and one of them is generate, interpret, and share global knowledge and evidence related to the development and implementation of arts and cultural policy. For example, the incredible work that the National Endowment for the Arts does, for us it's important that the rest of the members, their peers around the world, have an opportunity to also learn and exchange. On supporting our members, COVID has presented a substantial challenge for government agencies. One of the biggest ones for our members was not knowing who the cultural sector was. It was not enough to be part of the list of recipients of grants programs or those part of associations or unions, or being employed by the cultural creative industries or sectors. We noticed that what happened to the independent sector, the commercial sector, the rural and the remote, the unregistered, and so on. It seemed like an impossible universe to quantify. So I remind you, a couple of years ago, stimulus packages around the world started to emerge from governments, noting that the cultural and creative sectors needed support. Central governments would ask, I'm saying in general terms, who is your sector? What is your database? It was difficult to provide accurate answers, many of our members said. For example, in the UK, Arts Council England started to suddenly engage with a significantly larger group of people in the cultural and creative sectors, because those that had never really engaged with their council. It was a wonderful opportunity to know and learn broadly what the sector was, but at the same time, it became a challenge in terms of human capacity within their own council to be able to manage that. Another example is Chile, when the government asked, well, if you want support and a stimulus package for the cultural and creative sector, what numbers are we talking? And so Chile had to pull together and really go to the sector and say, come to us and tell us who you are. We need to build that database. And then they were able to argue. So, and now they are working on an agenda for the status of the cultural worker. So as you can see, data matters. We did a report here, which in fact, Martin Itamisuna, were working at the Inter-American Development Bank with you, was one of our authors, where we looked at the situation of the cultural and creative sectors. And this is a snapshot, again, more qualitative data, but again, really important to emphasize the precariousness and job informality that was a main concern. In September 2022, the World Conference on Cultural Policies and Sustainable Development, Mundial, met in Mexico City. We approached our members and asked them to share the urgent issues they faced as public investment agencies for the cultural and creative sectors, and here are their responses. You start to build a very consistent picture of what the issues are, don't you? The weakness and gaps in policy and regulatory frameworks, the responses to the crisis, global crisis, the unsustainability of the cultural sectors, again, the precarious nature of the working conditions and the low income for the cultural and creative sectors, and the lack of recognition of culture as part of key policy agenda. This data has given us the foundation to prepare our dossier, which was a roadmap to help members navigate and really push the recognition, the tangible recognition of culture. I won't go into details, but given it's in Spanish, influencing the authorizing environment, enhancing legislative frameworks, strengthening operating environments, and increasing and diversifying investment. There's a whole roadmap that we've developed with them. But again, we needed that information in order to create these pathways. Getting close to the end, I'd like to share with you that at Edifica, we believe absolutely in the power of data, and not just a means in itself, but to help tell our stories and to help us build the evidence, or with evidence, build the case for why arts and culture are so important. For this reason, we have created a data hub platform for our members. Regrettably, this is not a public document or a platform, but it does give you a snapshot of these are basically the areas that our members that government agencies have told us are important for them. This information is to help investing government agencies to learn from their international peers, create narrative from the governance to the cultural budgets, to how they finance and why, to how they disperse and why, to how they distribute how they contribute to the cultural and creative sectors in terms of the GDP, the employment, people's attitudes to arts and culture consumption, and how they evaluate, amongst others. And I'm sorry I had to redact it, but this is not public material, but this gives you a snapshot of what happens when you understand what the arts and cultural sector is doing and the job it's creating. In this particular country, if you drill down, you see that literature is the one that generates most jobs in this particular country. And then you can connect the dots in terms of what is your policy environment, what is your investment portfolio, and what is the sector saying in terms of, the public saying in terms of attitudes to culture. And here, another country wants to have a clear sense from the broader community, why should the arts receive public funding? Again, it creates a narrative to support those arguments back to securing those budgets. And finally, I will just say, and I'll hand over to Sunil, who I'm sure will speak much more eloquently than I will on these topics and give you some hard data here. For those of us that work with or in government, the cultural sector also collects an enormous amount of data, and sometimes we're not working closely together, although I would say that National Endowment for the Arts works very well with the sector. There are some incredible initiatives across the cultural and creative sector and other sectors that are doing really interesting work to help. And one that comes to mind is in Australia, the Audience and Outlook Monitor, which provides insight to help artists and cultural organisations monitor trends and connect audiences. There's obviously satellite accounts, and I would also emphasise the great work that the Inter-American Development Bank, conducts with your team, Trinidad. So I guess, humbly, I hope this has given you a picture of why data is so important. I'm not a data expert, I'm not an economist, but I'm incredibly passionate about the importance of data. I could not do my job without it, and Edifica would not exist. Thank you, Trinidad, back to you.
Thank you, Magdalena, and thank you for this incredible presentation, and also for the bank. Here at the bank, when we start working with the creative industries, the problem was the same, the lack of data. And we needed data to create and to promote these industries, but also to inform future loans and technical cooperations, etc. And also the narrative, why it is important, and it has a value to invest in the sectors in terms of the potential job creation, value added to the economy, and also the social impact. So we have been working in creating this research, like the book that we published with the UNESCO, Mercosur Cultural, CEGIP, OEI, or the one about investment, how the budget that governments support for the cultural sector. So now, Sunil, I would like to listen about what is your work here and the perspective in the US. We are talking a lot about the satellite accounts, etc. And sometimes we envy all this data that you have, and we follow very closely the studies that you make and how we can learn more about what you do.
Thank you very much, and it's really an honor to be here, and it was wonderful listening to Magdalena. I think a couple of the insights that I went away with in her talk were, and it's very true, that the data, particularly economic data in this case, extremely useful for helping to shore up the argument for what we call sometimes the precariat, the gig workers and artists and arts workers who are in the most precarious conditions and yet are some of the biggest contributors to our general economic well-being when it comes to the arts. So that's one ostensible use of the data. And secondly, of course, as you were saying, in times of economic duress, it's helpful to be able to show to government agencies and to appropriators and lawmakers, here's what needs to be supported. Here's how it's contributing to the economy. And we noticed that certainly with our own stimulus in the case making for stimulus packages. And that's what the arts organizations rallied around in making that case. So Great to hear that. So I just wanted to just talk a little bit about a very concrete example of data that we have for the cultural and creative economy, and a couple of other research resources. So again, I'm Sunil Iyengar, the director of the Office of Research and Analysis at the NEA, National Endowment for the Arts, which is relatively small, but in fact the lead premier arts agency in the federal government, whose mission is really to promote the arts across the United States, all the territories and states, through art making, arts performances, arts learning, and other ways. And we do have a research function. So what we do here in our office, more than a decade ago, we approached the Bureau of Economic Analysis within the Department of Commerce, and asked them if together we could construct a national data set that can tell decision makers and analysts about the footprint of arts and culture on the US economy. So this is the Arts and Cultural Production Satellite Account. It reports on an annual basis the total value added to GDP from arts and cultural goods and services. It also tells us how many workers are employed by arts and cultural industries and how much compensation they draw. And as you probably know, the arts in general have a sizable ripple effect on economic variables such as real estate, prices, local tourism dollars, and spending and job growth in other industries. But here we're measuring the direct impact of the arts on US GDP. So this tool is already being used by arts professionals and policymakers to track the economic well-being of the sector. And so I think it has a diagnostic purpose too for the sector, not just a case-making purpose. It's proved so successful that we've teamed with BEA to produce a version of this tool at the state level. So for each of the 50 states, and we even do some data for territories where we can. So you can go to our website, arts.gov, or the BEA's website for tables, graphs, and fact sheets. And in fact, we have a partner, the National Assembly of State Arts Agencies, which has created a kind of set of data dashboards based on each state. So you can kind of query the data there if you'd like. So as it happens, in a couple of weeks, we'll be releasing the new round of this data. And the data are always a little bit lagged. So we'll be releasing the data covering the year 2021 and the data preceding that. So we have a time series of data going back to the 90s. I'm going to be covering, just as an example, what we did last year in terms of the report, which covered up to 2020. And of course, 2020 was the first, as we know, was the first year of the pandemic. And so this will be an interesting use case, I think. So just to show you this, the first thing to say is that even in the first year of the pandemic, the arts continued to add more than 4% to the nation's economy, as it has done in previous years. The arts total value added was nearly $877 billion. That's greater than the economic contributions of other industries such as agriculture, mining, outdoor recreation or transportation, warehousing, and others. Also in 2020, as in prior years, the arts continue to provide a trade surplus. That is, we exported nearly $28 billion more in arts and cultural commodities than we imported that year. So the top line there is the exports and the bottom line is the imports. As you can see in 2020, that last year there, this occurred despite an overall reduction in import and export activity, undoubtedly because of the pandemic and the supply chain disruption it caused. In fact, for the last 22 years on record, the arts' economic footprint has been growing steadily and sometimes acutely. These two vertical bars represent exceptions to this growth. The Great Recession, as it's called here, of 2007 to 2009, marked one dip. That's that first vertical bar. And then, of course, again, in 2020, that year, that second bar, the total US economy shrank 3.4%. The total economy did. But that rate was nearly double for the arts economy, which shrank by 6.4%. That was a steeper decline than during the Great Recession, when the sector experienced a 5% dip in total economic value. So despite the arts punching in at more than 4% of US GDP, the sector remained among the hardest hit economically by the pandemic. So you see from the bottom two bars here that the total value added by performing arts organizations, that's music, dance, and theater groups, fell by an astounding 51% in 2020. And the bottommost bar, performing arts venues, sustained a 73% decline in economic output in 2020. So those declines for the performing arts exceed the losses for sectors such as food services, accommodation, oil drilling, and exploration and air transportation. And we know, of course, those anecdotally, those were very hard hit industries indeed. But it was even more severe numerically for performing arts venues and organizations. So I need to point out that many other arts industries saw precipitous declines in 2020. Industries such as museums, fine arts education, interior design, manufacturers of metalwork, woodwork, or musical instruments, sound recording, and self-employed artists when considered as an industry. The economic value of all these industries and some others I haven't mentioned fell by at least 20%. So, one of the things that's interesting to see, and it kind of dovetails with what Magdalena was saying, is when you see the data, you realize how heterogeneous the sector is. It truly is diverse, and there's so many different units to look at here, but it's good to have numbers for all of them. So all of this, of course, translates to job losses in the arts. This isn't on this slide, but let me just say for perspective, industries nationwide lost 6% of workers, but arts industries as a whole lost twice that, about 12%. Performing arts, again, was hit hardest, but you also had losses to arts-related construction, like the building or renovation of cultural facilities, and movies. In fact, the film industry, along with the performing arts, accounted for 40% of all declines in the arts workforce during this period. Juggling some papers. So with all those losses, you might wonder, how did the arts still manage to add $877 billion to the nation's economy, more than many other sectors? Well, that's largely because so many of the largest arts industries, like TV and radio broadcasting of arts programming, publishing, which is fueled in this case by software publishing, and government provided arts and cultural services, all those industries managed somehow to hold steady from 2019 to 2020. That's not to say there weren't some losses in the individual line items, but in general, those industries kind of held firm. Because many of them didn't move, we saw relative stability when we consider the arts and cultural sector as a whole, and because these are our largest industries. But of course, that pattern masks steep declines in many individual arts industries, as I've just said, including the performing arts, museums, and many of the others I said. So finally, I want to draw your attention here to these twin bars circled in red. The arts industry known as web publishing and web streaming of arts content was the only growth industry in the arts. It leapt by 14%, continuing a strong pattern of year after year growth at a fast clip. It also grew by 12,000 salaried workers. I'm highlighting this finding because in miniature, it points to one way in which arts organizations of all types and sizes are becoming more resilient by integrating technology with artistic creation and distribution. Recognizing this trend, the NEA has pledged in its new strategic plan to invest in the capacity of arts organizations and artists to serve a broader public through digital or emergent technology. So I'll just close by referencing a couple of other sources of data. So we also have at the NEA a grants program, which is alive and well right now. The guidelines are open for those of you domestically or who have partners in the U.S. Who would like to apply. So you can go to our website and learn about that. But people have gone to the NEA, to this grant program for the purpose of investigating economic value of the arts in a variety of ways. And we actually have our agenda posted on our website. You can look at what the research questions we're interested in. And there's a lot here to delve into. But I'll just point to a couple of studies. Well, first, just to describe briefly our programs. So we have two research grant programs. One funds individual studies, investigating the value or impact of the arts. And the other is the support of transdisciplinary research teams over multiple years to apply social and behavioral sciences methods to research on the arts. But the two studies, if I could just quickly mention without discussing findings, because I don't have the findings, they're still ongoing. In fact, they're recent grants we've made. A couple. One is to Texas A&M University at Corpus Christi. which is a primarily Hispanic city in Texas, to understand how cultural equity interacts with the creative economy to promote local economic and community development. Another study to the organization Nest Inc. At St. Louis, Missouri, is going to examine barriers to economic advancement for makers. Makers of you may have heard the term makers, whether they tinker or make things with woodwork or metalwork or with machines, but also artists and creative entrepreneurs, particularly for enterprises led by Black, Indigenous, and people of color individuals, and to identify solutions that can promote deeper inclusion of makers in local economies. And the last one here is what we call a research lab. So we're hoping they'll go on for a few years to investigate how arts and cultural districts can be drivers of economic and social change and still remain diverse, inclusive, and equitable places. So we're really proud of that award as well to Boise State University in Idaho. So some pretty far-flung areas, different areas within the U.S., and those are just examples for you. And I think I'll close by saying that as you can see from these examples, and I think Magdalena would agree, the conversation about economic value in the arts necessarily has to partake of the discussion of inclusion and equity, and it does anyway, but increasingly we're moving beyond maybe a cruder measure of understanding how the arts how the arts economy, what's the value for the total economy, and we're looking within that economy, what are some areas where we're seeing disparities, and how can agencies like the NEA help to uplift voices and cultural traditions that may not be monetized to quite the extent as some others. So I think there's a lot of rich discussion to be had about diversity, equity, and inclusion as it relates to the creative economy. Thank you.
Thank you, Sunil. That is super interesting, and that reminds me some of the outcomes or the conclusions that we had in our study that we did with UNESCO, Mercosur Cultural, CEGIP, and OAE. This study is called is the assessment of the impact of the COVID and the creative and cultural industries, and also with the regional public dialogue that we did in 2021 help us to really identify the areas that we need to work at the bank. And we knew some stuff. As Magdalena mentioned, we knew, but now we have the numbers. This publication that we did with UNESCO is the first macroeconomic research that is done in the sector. So it's very unique and gave us really important numbers to right now work with these sectors that we think they could help in the revamping of the economies in Latin America and the Caribbean. So I really recommend you to download this publication, and also another one that Magdalena was mentioning is about public funding for culture and creativity. We did this study in all the countries from Latin America and the Caribbean that are members of the bank, that help us also to understand how these sectors are funded from the public side, that are not just in the ministers of culture. So there are a lot of ways to really be creative in terms of how to use this information and also how to use the funds. And in this, I would like to also invite the people from the audience here at the bank or online to send us their questions. So we're going to be asking them, Sunil and Magdalena, the questions from the audience. And also I would like to ask you, before we have to take the opportunity, what do you think is good data to leverage public policy for public policy making in the creative economy? Because sometimes people gather data, but they don't know what to do with that. And so it's not just to gather, to collect this data, it's why and for what. So what is good data, Magdalena? in your case?
I wouldn't really know how to answer that. But data that is consistent, that is a decent pool, decent amount of a good sample, basically. If you've only got an example of 3 or 4 in a universe of thousands, then that's probably not going to be good data. But get a sense of what sampling you're using. I want to take Sunil's point about the diversity and inclusion aspect of it, because to me, good data is, where possible, thinking about who isn't represented, because particularly when it comes to public policy, it's not policy for some, it's policy for all. So good data is ensuring that you reach out to people that maybe are not as connected, or, you know, many of our members really go out into maybe rural or remote, or those that aren't consumers, typical consumers of, you know, cultural consumption. So kind of going outside of that if you want to get, for example, attitudes towards arts and culture. So really thinking about, and I would probably look at it backwards in terms of what are you trying to achieve, and then what's going to help you create that argument. I just want to add one thing that Sunil pointed out really well that I didn't mention, is also the diagnostic aspect, because it is about making the case, but it also about providing you with a snapshot of the reality. And sometimes we can assume certain things, like, you know, obviously the aspect of the data that Sunil showed around the live streaming, and that, you know, is really interesting in terms of the growth. So that shows that it's going sort of in one direction. And I guess underneath you start to peel that and say, who's reaping the benefits? Where are those resources going? Are they going back to the artists? Are they going back to the cultural workers? Or are they going back to more larger companies that have certain monopolies on certain platforms, for example? So I guess, but having that diagnostic gives you a sense of what you can work with. So I'm kind of skewing around what is good data, because it's very specific, but maybe Sunil, you can help me out and say what you think is good data.
Yeah, there are a lot of ways to answer that question. No, I would just say that we spend a lot of time, and certainly I have just now, going over numbers and, you know, being very empirical. But it's very helpful to get to your point, Magdalena, to have a qualitative basis for your work. So interviews, focus groups, surveys, you know, to try to get narratives that can help you identify the question and be as precise about your question as possible. And also bringing in voices from the community you're studying, or in this case, maybe the sectors, but also their beneficiaries. We didn't have the luxury of all that great qualitative spade work because we were working with another federal agency on a limited schedule. But I think, you know, it's always good to have that sound theoretical basis. In our case, we had literature and other sources we could draw upon for the theory, but to have a theory that motivates the data collection is important. And then, of course, the integrity of the data itself, and thinking about the different sources, and you know, I think what you said about large sample, but, you know, representative as far as you can make it, and thinking about any biases that creep in to the data collection and the report analysis and the reporting of the data, which are two different things. I think all play a role in quality of data. So I guess I'd leave it there.
Okay, here we do have a question from the audience, and we will listen to it.
So the first question we get is Diego Silveira from Uruguay. He's asking, once we have the data, how do you talk with the political sector to convince them that this dimension has to be taken into account when you make decisions about budget?
Who wants to answer?
Well, I'll take a stab. So we, you know, clearly there are a lot of people, policymakers, et cetera, who thrive on seeing measures like this and recognize immediately when you show them statistics, oh, this indicates a value proposition for investing in this good or service or program. But, you know, you have to always remember two things. One is there's competing priorities, and they're seeing this data alongside a whole raft of other data. So I think benchmarking and being clear, like what we've shown here, and I've heard other arts organizations and funders talk about, is the relative value of the arts in comparison to some other important services and goods, so that we can contextualize some of these findings. Context is very important. And the second thing is storytelling. We can't underrate that. And we need people to talk. And sometimes in interactions with policymakers and funders, what really grabs the attention isn't immediately the number. It's because they have a family member or a friend or who's an artist or is involved in the arts somehow, or they feel creative and they resonate on that level, but then the statistic may drive it home, right? Or the other way around, the statistic comes first and then the fact that they have this emotional attachment to the subject matter, carries the day. So I think you need both. Obviously you want to think independently and have, talking about good data, you want to have some kind of firewall between data collection and analysis on the one hand and kind of advocacy and messaging. But once the data are out there, it's free game, so anybody can take it.
Magdalena, would you like to add something to this?
I completely agree with what Sunil has said. I mean, and I've said it also throughout my presentation, it is about storytelling, and whether the evidence base follows or comes before, it depends on the context. But absolutely, the policy environment is saturated. And so, like in any environment, we need to really pick those moments that are going to be the precise ones, and to have a very clear messaging, whether it's matched with the diagnostic of it, making that case, and then being able to deliver on that storytelling and that qualitative, data that maybe we haven't spoken about as much. And let's not forget the strength of the sectors that we work with. Sometimes it's the artist, the very powerful poet that spoke at the inauguration of President Obama. Was, the powerful message that was, or, those instances when the art is the power and then the rest kind of follows. Let's not forget that we have a really rich and, we have this incredible cultural resource to draw from.
Thank you, Magdalena. And really the challenge is to think about arts, culture, and creativity, the creative industries, not as a nice to have when we solve all our problems, but on the other way is probably those are the answer to solve these problems. And we do have sound numbers and information and data that says that those are really interesting sectors to invest. It's not just spending money, it's investing money. We have another question from the audience.
Yes, we have one question for Magdalena and one question for Sunil. So Magdalena, what's the main challenge in getting data in Latin America? And for Sunil, about the way the National Endowment for the Arts and its research studies defines certain concepts that could be understood in different ways by the communities. For instance, when thinking of the concept of makers and creative entrepreneurs, was the definition of makers reached after the research or perhaps using inputs from the communities?
Magdalena.
Yes, thank you. I would say the main challenge, well, Latin America is a very diverse region, and there are certain countries that have really solid research institutes within the public sector, also independent cultural observatories to monitor what is happening from a more of a civil society perspective. So it's kind of a little bit difficult to give you an overall. But one of the challenges in Latin America, particularly operating globally, is the lack of data that is available in English. I think that is we find that we're constantly translating a lot of the data to make sure that it can also be seen. A lot of the data is actually quite good, but because it's not translated and a majority of the countries around the world know that they need to operate, whether we like it or not, English does seem to be the lingua franca. So we do need to have that, and that is a challenge. The other issue I find that within the Latin American context is also that it's sort of sometimes the data comes after when we realize where's the evidence. So we want to make the case, we know that it's important, and the evidence kind of follows late. And there doesn't seem to be as many longitudinal studies that we find. Again, I'm generalizing, but it's kind of difficult to find that sort of period frequency of data where, as Sunil was saying, they've got data that dates back to the 1990s or even earlier. So have that standardization, which actually helps you create or understand, have that diagnosis, and then be able to make the case. So longer term, language barriers and the lack of standardization. And I think that's where the Inter-American Development Bank, Trini, and the work you've been doing is really helping kind of create that common language so that, again, it can be compared and sort of learn from. And finally, I would say capacity building for the sector, because, as we said before, there's a lot of data that is being collected from the cultural sectors that they could also be contributing to the policy development or the studies being done by the government agencies. So there needs to be that intersection and that dialogue and that support to the sector, even when they're being funded for their cultural organizations, to build that into what they're doing and then help governments create this database that is going to help everybody in the long run. Sorry, couldn't answer one.
And Sunil, we have a few minutes for you, but
okay, great. Well, I'll just remind people what the question was. It was about basically, I referred to a study having to do with makers and creative entrepreneurs, and I think the questioner asked, did you come up with a definition before the study took off, or did you do it later, or is it done as part of the study? And in fact, this is a study that we're supporting through a research grant. So I would have to ask the principal investigator of that study, and I can find that out. That's actually worth knowing what the conceptual basis was for the choice of those terms. But I have a feeling that was something that's operationalized, as we say in research, before they undertook the study. But I want to address the spirit of that question, which is it's very important for us, I think, always to have clear definitions for all kinds of research projects we undertake. So I think that definitional question is one that ideally is a great opportunity for participation by the community members being studied, or by the sector being, that's going to be the one who's the subject of a research project.
Thank you, Sunil. And now they're telling me, even though it is Friday, we are competing with happy hour time. There's a lot of questions in the chat, and we are not going to be able to answer them, but we have a practice that we will do this time again. It's like we're going to get all these questions. Probably we will publish a blog summarizing these questions with answers for the whole audience. And now I would like to, invite you to the new session of this Voices in Action Creativity that will happen in 1 month with Ligia Amadio, a Brazilian orchestra conductor. We are going to talk about gender gap in the classical music sector, but in the creative industries in general. And finally, I would like to invite you all to take just 2 minutes to answer a poll through a QR code that is gonna be on the screens, and to download our digital badge for participating in this event. We will share the link in the chat as well, and for sure your opinion can help us to deliver better and more relevant discussion for the region. I'm really happy to have this conversation at the beginning of 2023, really inviting governments and the cultural sector to measure, to get and collect data so we can have a strong narrative to get the public policies that we deserve. So thank you so much to all of you. I hope you will find the QR code there. And thank you so much, Magdalena. We know that it's really early there in Melbourne. So thank you for being with us. And Sunil, it's a pleasure to have you here. It is so weird that we don't see each other that much since we're almost neighbors. So now we are going to change that. So thank you, everybody. Thank you for the people that are connected from the region. And we will be answering your questions. And thank you for the interest in this session. Goodbye.